this is my own personal perspective on the origins, the implementation and the legacy of the Balfour Declaration. 100 years in 20 minutes or 22 minutes. In 1914, Great Britain was still just the world's most powerful empire. Over a period of 500 years or so, through exploration, trade and settlement, treaties and the sword, missionaries, slavery, massacres and ethnic cleansing, Britain colonised Ireland, parts of the Americas, parts of Africa, Australia, New Zealand and much more. During the 18th and 19th century, negotiating with allies concerning the control of and division of unexplored territories or the provinces of potential enemies was standard empire policy. Empires plan, empires conquer, empires impose, and empires dispose according to their own interests. In August 1914, the British government was neither pro-Arab nor pro-Zionist. It was pro-British Empire, and its only objective in 1914 was to win the war. In the spring of 1915, the Allied planned to take Istanbul. If I can do this. Voila. To take Istanbul up here. Does this work? And knock Turkey out of the war. This plan precipitated the first wartime negotiations between the Allies for the partition of the Ottoman Empire. So this was before Hussein McMahon, before Sykes-Picot, before Balfour, before the Anglo-French Declaration of November 1918 and so on. This was the Constantinople Agreement. Russia said, we want Istanbul and the Straits. French said, we want Syria and Alexandretta and Cilicia. And the Britain, who didn't know actually what they wanted or what we wanted at that point, said, we reserve our right to claim Ottoman territories in due course. So that was the Constantinople Agreement. You then come, of course, to, and I'm just going through this very briefly, the Hussein McMahon Correspondence, the British effort to separate the Arabs from the Turks. June 1916, on the strength of this promise, the Sharif and his men duly started to attack Ottoman forces. My one comment, reflection about this correspondence, there were 9 letters in all between the two men, between July 1915 and March 1916. The British regarded these letters, this correspondence, as if they were written on a sheet of water. During the same period, in November 1915, Georges-Picot arrived from Paris and eventually ended up negotiating one-to-one with Sir Mark Sykes. And the agreement actually led to this. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was actually January 1916. The two of them then headed off by boat to St. Petersburg, and they negotiated with Sazonov, the wily, very experienced Russian foreign minister. Remember, Russia was still in the war till, whatever it was, February or so, 1917. So this is the actual Allied agreement in the middle of 1916. The only 2 points I would make here, apart from what the British and the French were doing, was that the Russians would take much of what is the eastern Anatolia. The Russians would have, as they wanted, the Straits up here, and, quite interesting, much of what is now southern Turkey was going to the Italians. Okay. The first contacts between the Zionist organisation as an organisation and the British government were unofficial and indirect around April 1916. By February 1917, Chaim Weizmann was endeavouring to persuade Sykes that Britain alone and not an Anglo-French condominium should determine the future of Palestine. So then we come to the famous slide that you all know. Never had a single sentence declaration been longer prepared, every word the subject of negotiation, 18 months of drafting and redrafting, its chief characteristic, deliberate ambiguity, the deliberate possibility of endless interpretations. For 17 months, the second and third phrases of the declaration did not exist. However, in October 1917, in order to neutralise Curzon and Montagu's opposition to the proposed declaration, Lord Milner instructed Leo Amery, one of the War Cabinet Secretariat, and both of them, of course, very pro the Zionist project. Milner instructed Amery to add on 2 additional phrases. Moreover, Balfour deliberately withheld the word political from the second phrase of the draft, so that only civil and religious rights were mentioned. The declaration was not simply a statement of intent. It reflected a determination on the part of the British government of the time and the Zionist organisation to set up post-war an exclusive pro-Zionist administration that would transform Palestine through Jewish immigration or colonisation, depending on your perspective, into a Jewish state. As Walid Khalidi succinctly remarked, the declaration changed Zionism overnight from a fantasy to a possibility. So, to summarise very briefly, the 5 factors which led to the declaration, this is my take on it. Wartime propaganda. In 1917, the war was in the balance, as has been explained. The British government was desperate for allies. It wanted to keep Russia in the war. Lord George's government hoped that Russian Jews and the Jews of the USA would become the agents of pro-British propaganda to aid the war effort. Secondly, anti-French sentiment. By 1917, Lord George wanted to keep France out of Palestine, to acquire Palestine for Britain. One way of doing this was to make an alliance with the Zionists. A successful Zionist claim would also provide an entree, a kind of fig leaf or half a fig leaf, to ward off post-war accusations of British imperial land grabbing. Thirdly, anti-Semitism, colonial mindsets. If you combine these first 2 factors with Lord George's and others' anti-Semitic misconceptions, which have already been mentioned about some Jews on a global level holding inordinate financial and political power, and the fact that the British cabinet held exaggerated beliefs, in fact, of the influence of Jews both in Russia and in the States. And combine that with the colonial mentality of these decision makers, not just Lord George, but Weizmann and his colleagues as well, who dismissed as of no significance the Arab majority in the region. Fourthly, Chaim Weizmann, the visionary lobbyist. Weizmann, indeed, in my view, is a key figure, a key lobbyist in this drama. He grew up under the Tsar's oppressive regime, oppressive to the Jewish community there. He arrived in Britain in 1904. He met Churchill first in 1905, Balfour in 1906, and Lord George in 1914. In fact, Weizmann met with Lord George, Prime Minister Lord George, 7 times during the war. and, by his own account, had 2,000 meetings with British officials at the highest level during this decisive period. Weizmann was a persuader extraordinaire. There was no Palestinian equivalent of Weizmann. The Palestinian Arabs had no such entree or influence, none whatsoever, in the corridors of power of London, Washington, or Paris. Finally, Christian Zionism. In some ways, in my view, it was a relatively small factor, but I mention it now because it's very significant today, in today's mix. In Britain, during much of the 19th century, some evangelical movements espoused the conversion of the Jews to Christianity and their restoration to Palestine. And among them, foremost among them perhaps, was Lord Shaftesbury, a leading British politician and reformer who actively campaigned for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And he lobbied Prime Minister Palmerston to have them returned to Palestine. However, I would argue that in 1917, although Lloyd George and his war cabinet certainly saw Palestine as the landscape of the drama of the Bible, none of them were born-again Christians. They were hard-nosed imperialists. The other major element in this 19th century mix, of course, is Zionism. In the late 19th century, Zionism was transformed from an intellectual, cultural exercise into a political project through the drive and vision of, mostly through the drive and vision of this man, Herzl, Theodor Herzl. By the beginning of the 20th century, after centuries of discriminatory legislation in the Russian Empire, persecutions, massacres, pogroms, increasing numbers of Jews concluded that there was no future for them where they were. Assimilation had not worked, the New World beckoned, and Palestine. For some evangelical Christians, therefore, and for Zionist Jews, the colonization of Palestine was seen as an act of return and redemption. In some respects, political Zionism initially had a noble aim as a reaction to centuries of persecution and pogroms. However, the problem for the Zionists, a problem they studiously and consistently ignored, was that Palestine was not empty. So, from 1920, for about 20 years, the British supported the establishment in Palestine of Jewish political, economic, social, cultural, and educational organizations, the embryo of a Jewish state. During the same period, the British successfully blocked all Palestinian Arab political development. As has already been mentioned, Rashid Khalidi argues that Palestine was already lost to the Zionists by the late 1930s, in other words, before the Second World War, before the Holocaust, and before the events of 1948. Oh, whoops. Thank you. Doublespeak does not work. I would describe British attitudes and policies towards the Jews during the Mandate period as a mixture of support, sympathy, and benign disdain, all subsumed beneath imperial priorities. In some ways, it's simpler to characterize British policy towards the Arabs of Palestine. Indifference, humiliation, and duplicity are the words that come to mind. It's not surprising, it's standard empire behaviour, I'd like to share two very brief examples of British duplicity, still unacknowledged after 100 years. Firstly, post-World War I, during the 1920s, government ministers and officials, in other words, Winston Churchill and Sir Herbert Samuel, repeatedly and explicitly denied that the government intended to establish a Jewish state in Palestine, when in fact that was the deliberate intention from 1917 onwards. Secondly, and much more significantly, the State Archives reveal that the highest priority British policy, the unspoken bedrock of British policy in Palestine from 1920 to 1938, was, in contrast to Egypt and Iraq, the deliberate withholding of democracy. Balfour was absolutely clear on this. He wrote that, quote, Palestine was an exceptional case. There would be no self-government in Palestine until the Jews became a majority. Only then would democracy be allowed to develop. The policy rested on two fundamental issues: immigration and democratic representation. The British knew that the Palestinian Arab leadership were aware of Zionist intentions. Privately and correctly, the British assessed that a representative legislative assembly, if established, and however limited its power, would therefore vote to restrict Jewish immigration. So it was blocked. Nevertheless, successive British governments proclaimed to the Palestinians, and annually at the League of Nations, that Britain was A, endeavouring to be even-handed, holding the ring between two competing communities, and B, the British were preparing Palestine for democratic self-government, as required by the Sacred Trust Clause in the League Covenant. The state records clearly reveal this decades-long British double-speak. The reality of this undeclared policy was confirmed a few years ago, surprisingly and ironically, by the late Sir Martin Gilbert. Sir Martin Gilbert, advisor to 4 British Prime Ministers on the Middle East, and one of the most distinguished British historians of his generation, and certainly the most distinguished Zionist historian of his generation. And at a lecture a few years ago in Israel, in 2011, he said this: the cornerstone of British mandatory policy was the withholding of representative institutions for as long as there was, in Palestine, an Arab majority. This was at a very distinguished lecture at Ben Gurion University to an exclusively Jewish audience, and I can only surmise that Sir Martin temporarily lapsed into balance and lapsed into clarity when he said this. This statement is, I would argue, a key, perhaps the key to understanding much of what actually happened in Mandate Palestine during this period. Namely, the growth of Jewish institutions and immigration, the increasing frustration of the politically powerless Palestinian Arab population, and the inevitable outbreak and suppression of the Arab revolt between 1936 and 1939. The implementation of the declaration from 1920 to 1939 thus led directly, in my view, to 1948 and to much of what has happened since. So, to conclude, instead of simply celebrating, Mrs. May and her government should also mark this centenary by publicly grappling in a transparent manner with the moral and political legacy of this statement. I'll just finish by saying a nation, our nation, including its government, which only has room for celebration, for national pride, and has no room for honest reflection about its past, has little claim to describe itself as either moral or civilized. Thank you.